George Gamota, and I'm the chair of the Lexington Remembers World War II Committee. And tonight we're commemorating the special 75th anniversary of the end of the beginning of World War II. I say the beginning because we are ending what's happening on the East. And of course, we have still a war going on in the Pacific. But so today we're referring it to as VE Day, Victory in Europe. And on September 2nd, we will have Victory in Japan. And that completes the war. But for our panel tonight, we have two World War II veterans and one wife or wife-to-be World War II veteran. Her husband, Alan, is over someplace in Europe. And our two veterans, one is on the boat, Sam Berman, just returning to the US when he heard about it. And Dan Fenn is somewhere in Italy when he heard it. And so my role as a moderator is going to be basically to hear what was the reaction of the veterans, your colleagues, to war ending, your family members, and others. And Wilda will tell us a little bit about the home front. I mean, her fiance, is over there and the war is over. What was her feelings? How about the family members? So what I like to do is kind of go through the panel and have each person talk about a little bit, and then we can open it up for questions and answers. With us tonight, we have Dan Fenn, and most people know Dan as a big Lexingtonian, former selectman, longtime town meeting member, and John Kennedy's chief of staff when Kennedy was president. However, you're going to learn a little bit about him as a World War II veteran, having served during the war in Italy. We also have with us Sam Berman, who was, I guess, a student at the University of Wisconsin when war started, and he signed up for the U.S. Army Air Corps and did 70 missions flying over enemy lines. And then last we have Mrs. Ellen Ward, Wilda, who, as I mentioned, was a bride-to-be with her husband overseas. But she's going to tell us a little bit about what it felt like in Lexington. It was a big celebration, or people had a little scotch to drink and say, hey, it's done, and we'll find out what happened here. And the idea of the panel is for each person to give a short talk, and then we can open it up for questions and answers. So with that having said, Dan, would you like to start?
All right.
Sure, George. I was called to active duty on March 11, 1943. I was a junior at Harvard College at the time. And we, a whole group of us, went to Fort Devens, sworn in and got our uniforms and got inspected and poked and jabbed and all kinds of stuff. I can still smell that coal smoke at Fort Devens, and got stowed away in the barracks. It was still pretty chilly, and I remember being assigned to guard duty. I don't exactly know what we were guarding against, but we tromped up and down that cold area around Fort Devens. I got a 3-day pass to go home, and I saw my parents and my sister, my brother, and my grandmother. And that was the last time I got home to Cambridge until Halloween night, 1945, when everything was over.
Wow.
I went to Miami Beach for basic training in a couple of schools. And then I was assigned to the 767th Bomb Squadron, 461st Bomb Group. I don't know if you can see the hat. Obviously, we didn't have fancy hats like this during the war. That came with some reunions. I served in totally unheroic roles in the bomb squadron and the orderly room. I hope worthwhile, and I hope I did it well for about 20 months. And then our adjutant, Captain Ray Wilkowitz, great guy, later a judge in New York, said to me, Dan, he said, there's an opening for warrant officer in the Mediterranean Theater, in the Army Air Corps, as it was known then. And why don't you take the exam and see what happens? So I studied Army regulations for a few days, sort of at random, and took the exam. The only question I remember on the exam was, how many horses do you have at a corporal's funeral? I think it was 2, but I can't remember for sure. Anyway, for some crazy reason, I got the top score in the Mediterranean Theater, and they had an interview with a bunch of senior officers in the bomb wing of which we were a part, the 15th Air Force, flying B-24s, Liberators. And lo and behold, I became a warrant officer. So we didn't need a warrant officer in the 461st. So they moved me to something called the Mediterranean Air Transport Squadron, which a bunch of washed out pilots flying generals' gloves from one site to another. So I was at Matt's, not in my old outfit, when the war came to a close. And, you know, it's kind of strange, but there wasn't a big celebration. I remember hearing a recording of the Pennsylvania polka. I remember some of the officers, because they were the only ones who had pistols, firing some pistol shots. There wasn't a party. There wasn't a big celebration. And I've often wondered why, because this was a pretty momentous occasion. I guess partly because it was pretty obvious finally it was coming. And also, and even more, because World War II wasn't over. We still had the Japanese to deal with. And our orders to pack up, and there was a boat waiting for us in Naples Harbor. So our job was to pack up and get ready to go to Japan. My old outfit went back to the United States after out to VE Day and disbanded, but we were to go to Japan and keep going, and we weren't even going to get to stop for any home leave on the way. So maybe those two reasons were why it wasn't a huge big deal.
Why was it a big deal in New York? I mean, we have all the parades and everything going. And I'm just surprised that the guys on the ground didn't think it was a big deal.
I don't know if those people that we see in the pictures in New York were people who hadn't gone over yet or who had come back. I just don't know.
Are those pictures ones that were taken after the day?
Well, I can't remember. I think that may be right. Robert Ford, the news commentator, announcing that it was all over finally. I will say that, all this about the greatest generation, we certainly didn't feel like heroes. We, at least all the people I was with, we groused about the food and the stupid officers and the weather and the spam and the reconstituted eggs that we had, and most of all, we just wanted to go home. We just wanted to have it over with. That was the continuing thoughts on our minds.
Okay, well, Sam, your story is a little bit different because you were actually on the boat returning home when you heard about it. Do you want to tell us your story?
I actually enlisted in the Army Air Force in 1942 in December.
You're right there.
I was in Wisconsin, and I actually enlisted in a town of Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I don't remember exactly when I got into my first training group, but I know I went to Shepherd Field in Texas for basic training. And that's where you find out you're in the Army and hate it. And then I went to radio operator school. Well, first, I went to radio operator school in Kansas City. And then I went to gunnery training in Florida. At one point, I went to Mary College, where we were waiting to get into the pilot training group. But then when they got ready to put me in the pilot training group, they do a physical exam. They found that one of my eyes was divergent. He said, "You'll double." I didn't see what was wrong with seeing double, but he said I couldn't be a pilot. But I thought it was great because sometimes if anything looks good, you see it twice as much. Anyway, we flew south from Florida. We flew in a B-25 because our mission was to take a new plane over with us. So I was flying as a radio operator then. And we flew south to Berlin, Natal, Brazil, and then to Natal, Brazil, and then over from there, which is the big bulge in South Africa, to Ascension Island, which is halfway to the big Africa. And when we got in Africa, that was when they assigned the days to where we were going to end up. I was going to end up at the 12th Air Force because I was just telling Dan that somebody there tried to sell me a monkey. And they said that I could have the monkey for $1. And I thought that would be fun to have the monkey as a pet while I was overseas. So I was willing to buy the monkey. Somebody said, "Let you keep it." So I did buy it. And then I found out that the African who was selling the monkey was selling that monkey every time he met an American. And at night, the monkey would escape and go back to him, and he would sell it again the next day. So I think that's what they call monkey business. Anyway, I got over to Corsica, and I was flying at first as a radio operator, gunner, and then later on as a bombardier and a navigator, because they needed people in that area, so they gave us a quick training. My first 8 missions were over southern France. I think the first mission I flew was Nice, which is a beautiful city, and I'm sorry we bombed it, because who wants to ruin a beautiful city? And then we started flying over northern Italy, and we were tactical. We bombed bridges, military stations. We tried to disrupt their activity, and I always felt good afterwards because that we weren't out there to bomb people or other soldiers. We were just trying to disrupt them. Somebody had to kill them, but we didn't have to do that. But probably we if we did, it was inadvertent. And then I flew 70 combat missions, and coming back here, up in Rimini, Italy, on the Adriatic coast of Italy. Beautiful there. It was a beautiful place. I should have stayed for a while. And we got on a boat to come back, and halfway across, that was in May, on May 8th, when VE Day occurred. We were on the boat and it was still a few days away from the States. So we celebrated on the boat. We were very happy that the war was over. But when we got to the United States, and I can't remember where we landed. I know we got taken to Fort Devens. We may have landed in Boston. And we were taken to Fort Devens. They sat us down and they said, they went through our record. They want to know how many combat missions we've flown. They want to know how many days and years we've been in the Army. They want to know how many medals we've gotten. They had a point system. And when you got to all the points together, if you had a certain number of points, you could get out of the Army right then and there. And I just made it. I just had enough points. So they asked if I wanted to stay in the reserve. So my question was, what is all the way out? And they anyway, that's what I took. And my brother, I was with a friend who'd been with me from the very beginning. His name was Bob Busa. He was from Vermont. And he and my brother, who was not in the Army, he was married and had a couple of kids. So he was one of the few young men that was not in the Army. He was in his 30s already. So he came and picked us up, and we went out that night to celebrate, and he took us down to Scully Square.
Oh.
And Scully Square was full of soldiers, sailors, and Marines, and everybody in the military. And we all talked trash to each other. Yeah, said the things that you say when you're in the military to another military person, how you did nothing, we did everything. And my brother kept worrying that we were going to get in the fight. And we were going to aggravate somebody to the point he didn't understand that we all felt the same way about it. We were just happy to be out. But right about that time, I had a brother who was in Okinawa, and he'd taken a bullet in the arm, and it severed his motor nerve in his left arm. And he was back in Natick at the Army hospital, and they did a years of surgery on his arm, putting the nerve back there again. And another brother who was in the Merchant Marine, and he had just come back. So the three of us were celebrating together. And, my brother-in-law was an actor, and he was early in his career, but he had a 16mm movie camera. So he took a movie of me and my brother who'd been in the merchant marine. And first of all, he had us driving the car up to our house, and for some reason he switched. This was just a comedy. He switched, and all of a sudden we were walking to the house. And when we got there, our house had four windows upstairs and 2 windows downstairs on the front of the house facing the street. And he had my sister, who had married him, yelling out the window, "Oh, it's Jack and Sam." And somebody else stuck their head. All of a sudden we had everybody out of a window cheering, and they all came rushing out the front door and started jumping around and hugging each other, and left us standing there doing nothing. Anyway, we still had that movie. I just went back to the University of Wisconsin the following semester. So that was my story of coming out of the Army. It was later on when we all celebrated the end of the war in Japan.
Okay, but your brother Nakanawa came home after the surgery, right? Or did he stay there?
He was luckily they sent him to Natick to do the surgery, so he could come home frequently whenever he was not being. He had no military duties, so we saw him.
Okay, great. Okay, Wilda.
Yes.
You were here in Lexington when you heard the news. What did you do?
Yes, actually, I lived in Lincoln at that time, and we heard it on the radio, and of course, we're very much excited about it, and got together with some of Alan's family members that evening, I remember, and we were so excited that we were wondering, of course, when he would be back. He had joined the service, the Army Air Force, on the 27th of December, 1941. And he was in the service for 3 years, 10 months, and 27 days. And I saw him in some of the interesting things that I was going to say, as you wanted to know during the war. Alan ended the service with 2 other buddies, and they got together, and their serial numbers were right in order so they could all stay together. This was their plan. Well, that was on the 27th of December. By January 4th, Alan was in California, Franny was in Kansas, and the other one was in Westfield in Massachusetts. They never saw each other again until the end of the war. And Alan went to the Boeing School of Aeronautics right from entering. He was there January 4th and enjoyed that very, very much. And when he was through, he was headed for Europe. And with his mother and father and my mother and myself, we went out to see him. He was stationed at Westfield in Springfield for just a few days, actually, before he went along to England. And from there, he decided he would be a radio operator and enjoyed that very, very much. He did that all the way through the war and had some interesting experiences going over. One of the exciting things that he had was when they flew from south of France over North Africa. There was a whole crew, of course, he was in a C-47, and there was a whole crew of them. I mean, not a whole crew, but a whole bunch of C-47s, and they dropped their fellows over an airport in North Africa, and they had to circle the field until these fellows that they had just dropped took the field, so that all these planes could land because they didn't have gas to go back to England. And that was kind of exciting, one of the things he had. Another interesting thing was he flew the hump towards the end of the war at going from China, Burma, India, and he was stationed in India. He had a chance to go to see the Taj Mahal, which was exciting for him. And for 4 months, they only put a crew on over there. Well, there were several people that flew, of course, several planes, but they only had a 4-month at time to be there because it was so dangerous, and like 70% of them never came back. It was terrible. And then when he came back, and he was stationed in Brindisi in Italy, and one of the interesting things there was that he they were bringing some supplies to Yugoslavia, as it was then. And on the way back, they were shot at over the Aegean Sea. And when Alan was a radio operator, so he did his job. And by the time that the plane sank, they all got out and were in those little dinghies they had. By the time the plane sank, the PBY was coming over the horizon to find them and rescue them. That was exciting. Then he came back through, when the war was over, they came back through South America, not South America, they came first across Africa and landed on Ascension Island, and then went into Brazil, and then came back up to the United States. And I wanted to tell you one thing that was interesting during the time. When Alan was in California going to Boeing school, my father gave me a birthday present and said I could call him. Well, at that time, I had to call the telephone company there in Lincoln and tell them that next Sunday at 3 o'clock, I was going to make a call to this number. Alan had given me the number, and it was going to be to Alan Ward, and it would last for 3 minutes. I had to let them know that a week ahead, that I was going to make a telephone call. Now the Sunday came, it was a Sunday afternoon, and I made my call at a certain time, called the operator there in Lincoln, and all the way across the country, I could hear Springfield here, sending the call, then it came into Buffalo, New York, and then it was into Chicago, and across the into Kansas and so forth, and finally got to Allen in California. And we were, you heard the operator come on every time they went to a state. She said, so-and-so here, passing it on to Kansas and so forth. So that was fun, and we talked for 3 minutes, which was very exciting. And then we saw him when he did come home in June, as I told you. We saw him for just about 2 hours, and then we didn't see him again until the end of the war. I was in high school through that time, and it was kind of sad because we always would go when any of the fellows were going away. Several of my high school class went, and of course we were the younger ones, so when they got off, I graduated from high school in '43, and by that time, some of the fellows, when we were the year before, were able to enlist, and it was sad. There was one fellow that he went and enlisted, and like in 3 weeks he was killed. It's so hard to do that. We didn't see a lot of things going on as far as like out of Boston Harbor. We learned afterwards all the terrible things that went on, and the ships that bombed right out, that were taking supplies to England. We didn't hear about that. And we did go all through the year of the war. We had to paint the searchlights. The headlights on the car were painted halfway down black, so that it had no sky view to show at during that time. And we had to use things on the windows so that you wouldn't put out any lights at night. And they were like over Sandy there was some, I see up there on the on his curtain, we had a lot of curtains like that we pulled along at night so that no lights would go out. We had rationing. We had gasoline, butter, I remember, was rationed. A whole bunch of food was rationed. you had enough gasoline, especially, you had enough gasoline to do your job. You could get to work, you could get gasoline so you could do your shopping and things like that. You just didn't take any long trips. I'm like, never to go to New Hampshire or something like that, because there wasn't enough gas for that. But you had ample gas to do your job and do what had to be done.
How about after VE Day? Did a lot of these things change, or are you, continued?
I think it was right after the war in Europe that all the rationing was ended. And then it was just like now, whenever the stuff started coming back again, it was great, because as it's going right now, some of the places had been converted to war materials and had to be reconverted back into the things that they had originally been making. And so we went through the same type of things that are going. I don't remember like this toilet paper thing that everybody's got out, took up toilet paper now. I don't remember running out of anything. The only thing is you couldn't have a lot of, but I never remember the paper supplies having a problem like they're doing now. It was interesting. Have any of you any questions at all? Oh, most of the time when we get any news about the war, it was on the movies. We didn't hear about things that went on right off. Of course, they didn't have the television and things like that.
The eyes and ears of the world was the news.
That's right.
That's right. You saw in the movies.
That's right. And that's when we saw all that happened in New York. We heard about it, but when you saw the pictures of the sailor kissing the nurse, remember that famous picture? And that just went all over the newspapers, and everything else would feature that particular picture. And we saw the movies about Times Square and all that was going on in New York there.
That was on VE Day, the celebration in New York.
That's right. That's right. And that was in August. Right. Yeah.
And I suspect that it may be in San Francisco or the West Coast, they were celebrating more the VJ Day.
That's right.
Hawaii, certainly.
That's right. Yeah. I'll tell you one little interesting situation. I was invited to one little party when some friends get home, and they had been in the Marines in Iwo Jima and those islands in that area. And we were all there were 10 of us there. So that meant there were 5 of the Marines and 5 of us gals. And these had just been school friends, and we're so glad to see them when they got back. But we girls didn't notice it, but a thunderstorm came along. And lightning but thunder, about 3 or 4 big claps of thunder. Those 5 Marines dove under the tables. I mean, it was somebody pulled a plug. And then they were so embarrassed because we girls were sitting there looking at them saying, what the heck was that? Why did they do that? And realized it sounded like bombs. And their instant reaction, we didn't need that. We didn't need that. We felt so bad for these guys. So that a lot of came home, things like that was so hard on them. It really was.
Well, as you know, in Lexington, there were like 1,600 people, veterans, men and women who served. And the town was only about 6,000 population.
That's right.
So you know that every family probably had someone serving from Lexington.
That's right.
Well, my story, I was 5 years old when the war ended, but I was in Vienna, and I was hiding, and they were still bombing Vienna, and the typical thing was that men and women were separated, at least where I was. Women hid in cheese caves. There are caves around there. This is near Vienna, Beethoven's Woods, in case some of you know where that is. But there are a lot of caves there. So women hid in the caves, and men went out in the fields, in the forests. And so when the bombing ended, broadcast that war has ended, people just jubilated, came out and celebrated, and it was like a feast. For 3 days, they celebrated. Austrians, everybody, because, you know, this was a very terrible thing. As you know, Vienna was devastated, as many of the other cities. So that's, you know, my story of VE Day, and I remember it vividly, even as a grown-up. So it's a special day in my memory. Now, I know Ivor Morgan is over here. He was in Britain or Wales at the time. Do you remember anything from VE Day, Ivor?
Well, actually, I think you kind of simplified my story a bit. I lived basically between London or West Wales, if people know the geography of Britain. Wales is the bit that sticks out towards Ireland. And my family are Welsh-speaking Welsh. We come from the hills. And that's a good thing in times of war. At the day war broke out for me was 1939, of course, unlike the rest of you. And in 1939, the day war broke out. My brother and I were in West Wales with our grandparents. They had moved back. They had been in London into the Welsh countryside, fortunately. And their house was perched on a Welsh hill. And my elder brother and I were playing with their car, and the car was on a steep slope that went down to a T-junction. And fortunately, when it started moving, my grandmother, with superhuman effort, managed to divert this car into the ditch. How she ever did that, I never know. That was my beginning of the war. That was the day war broke out. Of course, all of you know that the war in Britain didn't really happen for almost another year. It's what we call the phony war. And during the phony war, there was no bombing from Germany. And consequently, my mother, who had my elder brother, me, and a baby in arms at that time, she did not want to leave all of us with her parents in the countryside. And the Welsh had established in London, they basically ran the milk businesses in London, my grandparents' generation. So I come from one of those families that were doing that in an essential activity. And so my mother said, okay, there's no war, they're not going to bomb us. So off I went back with my older brother back to London. Of course, you also all know that timed perfectly with the beginning of the Blitz. That's when Hitler decided he was going to bomb the hell out of the Brits. And so childhood for me was living in this house. My parents set up bunks for us under the staircase, and at night the air raid sirens would go. I still hear them, by the way. My wife, who was the enemy, she's a German, she also has the same problem with air raid sirens. It goes right to the middle of your spine. We would go out at night looking up at the searchlights. I don't know if you know what searchlights are. These are big beams of light that go up to try to pick out aircraft in the sky. And this was sort of kids' spotters time. We'd stand out looking for German aircraft in the hope that they'd catch one in the searchlight. And in the local park, we had an anti-aircraft gun, just not far away, actually, short walk. And so that would be blasting off at something. And that carried on until Hitler decided to turn around to Russia. I was not in the east end of London, that was the worst hit, but we had bomb sites all over the place, of course. But these were bombs. At that point, my mother said, well, kids, you can't stay in London because they keep bombing it. So back I went to Wales. Hitler goes to Russia, and then it quietens down in London. So mother said, hey, you better come back to London again. So back I went to London. And I'd already started school in Wales, in a village school, a one-room school. My teacher was Miss Evans. I remember her well. And so back I went to London, to a state school in London, close by. At this stage, Hitler decided to use something else against Britain. And these are weapons that a lot of you are probably not familiar with. They were called the V1 and V2 bombs. V1 was we called them doodlebugs. They flew like planes. They didn't have much of a glide path, but they flew like planes. They had a single engine on the back. And when the engine stopped, when it presumably ran out of fuel or something, you knew it was going to go in this rather steep glide path and explode. And so you could hear these things. And in fact, one day, very nearly, we knew that this one was close by. I was hiding under the staircase, as was my habit. And the rest of the family were on the front doorstep watching this thing. The engine cut, and it almost hit us. It landed at the bottom of our road. And just to give you a sort of order of magnitude, that plane, that bomb, I believe, killed 26 people. It blew up a whole block. That was a V1. Now, I also experienced a V1 when I was at school there. We had, of course, the alarm go, and we had a drill to go under the desks and so on. And we could hear this darn thing. I still remember it. We're all there. Engine stops. That all goes very silent, right? And of course, what you're waiting for is for the bang. And it banged. And it was much further away. I know where it was. I won't bother to tell you where. It actually much further away than I thought it possibly could have been, because the engine was really quite loud. And the V2s you didn't hear. The V2s were what we now call ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. They just went up and came down, so you didn't hear them. They had no glide path, and they caused more damage. While that was going on, my mother said, well, you boys, you can't stay in London. So they sent she sent me and my younger brother this time up to the north of England. My father was in the Air Force and all that. He was learning to be a navigator in Africa. That's another whole set of stories. My relatives were trained. One of my uncles who had just died, trained to be a pilot in Canada. And that was the classic sort of Morgan picture. And so my mother had a friend up in Lancashire, which is not my culture. But off we went to Lancashire. Is a mill town, if you know England at all. It's a place called Rochdale, which used to be in the cotton trade. That's before they lost all that. It's on the west side of the north part of England. And up to Lancashire we went, to Rochdale. I went to school in Rochdale. And at this point, of course, eventually the war was winding down. And actually, VE Day, I ended back in London. And some of you may have seen the PBS this last week, a series on the Queen and her family. And at the end of the war, you see a picture of them coming out of Buckingham Palace onto a balcony of Buckingham Palace at the end of the mall, with a whole crowd of people around in front. Well, I was there. And this is when the lights came on in London. I'm sure this happened on more than one occasion then. The lights came on. We'd been in blackout all the way through. It's curious, I see movies now where they have tape over the window to stop the blast and the glass anybody having tape on their windows. I think there was no supply of tape. We didn't have such a commodity at all. However, the end of the war, the royal family at that point was extremely popular, the Queen in particular, and her parents, who is now the Queen still. And the crowd, as I remember, I was there with my mother. My father was still in the Air Force. I subsequently, after the war, became an Air Force person, Air Force officer, and so on. But that's another story. And the crowd was shouting, and of course, the royal family had to keep coming out onto the balcony, and that was it. And the lights went up in London, and we hadn't seen lights in the street anywhere for years. Cars everything was blackout. And you had inspectors going around checking that you couldn't see light, and for obvious reasons. So the war for me was indeed chaotic. I still regard West Wales as my home in some sense. It's the Welsh Hills, they're very beautiful, a lot of sheep. Nobody in their right minds would bomb a place like that, of course. But London was something else, and it really was. Nobody knew what was happening. My mother's attempt at forecasting was absolutely awful. I mean, and of course, she thought the war was beginning when it was declared. It turned out not to be. So back we go, because she thought it wasn't going to happen. And of course, it happened exactly at that point. So I was there for the Blitz, and I was there for the Doodlebugs, because people in Britain didn't understand what was happening on the continent. I have these memories, they're very strong, and we used to play on bomb sites, which is not advisable, by the way, because you don't know which part of the bomb site is going to fall over and kill you. But I'm sure a lot of kids lost their lives playing on bomb sites. And
Yeah,
they
I know what you
stuck
mean.
around in London for decades. They were not eradicated for decades after the war.
Yeah. George Burnell, turning from Britain back to Lexington, you were a kid here in Lexington. I know, what were your feelings like when the war in Europe ended?
So, my family was here. My father was a auxiliary policeman and an air raid warden. My mother ran the Red Cross, and so they were active, and the town, of course, was owned and operated by volunteers. And we had a volunteer fire department. There was an alarm. The belfry was located down by the common, and there was a siren in the belfry. So when there was a fire event, the siren would ring a location, a 1 and then a 2, that was location 12. A 1 and then a 3 was location 13, and the volunteers would head for that location. I would say that there was more focus in Lexington on Europe than there was on Asia. I think that's primarily because most of the people we knew went to Europe. The Pacific was slower in developing because you had to move island to island. So there was a battle, and then there was not that much happening, and then another island. Whereas in Europe, you were having reports all the time. And so when VE Day occurred, the first thing that happened was the air raid siren blasted. And within minutes of that, every church bell in Lexington was ringing. So the Hancock Church, the bell was, they were doing their thing. And then people, that's how they learned that something was going on. And the word just spread. I mean, it was like the town crier. Everybody was, did you hear? So this is over, this is over. So there was a celebration everywhere with every family and every church group, every social group, every neighborhood group. They were having celebrations. And that's what was going on here. Everybody was calling relatives, but I don't know of any organized activity. Everything was spontaneous.
Was it mostly in Lexington, or did you hear what was happening in Boston?
Oh, we knew the next day. You know, the papers were full of it. You got most of your news came over the radio. The movie theaters showed double features, and they always had the news, 15-minute news segment as part of the movie show. But that was a week later. You know, it took time. They had to process the film, develop the film, and ship the film and deliver it. So you, from the movie point of view, you weren't seeing things for a week after at least a week after the incidents were filmed. So everything was basically over the radio. And WHDH and WBZ were the big ones that I knew of. And then we kept on going. We had the rest of the war to fight.
Right.
And the celebration didn't last. I don't remember it lasting. The celebration portion, I don't remember lasting more than a day or two. The feeling, the emotion of everybody was changed, because that's when you knew you were gonna, you turned to the west. You knew that you were gonna win. You knew that you were gonna finish business. And so it was all that doubt was gone. You were now sure that you were right and that you were gonna win. And there was a deep felt hatred for the Japanese. I gotta mean, it was deep. You know, every noontime, I'm not sure whether it was WHGA, Kate Smith came on at noon sharp singing God Bless America. And there's nobody that's ever sung that song better. And I, to this day, I hear that, and man, I snap to attention. that was what we lived on. And after VE Day, remember Pearl Harbor was the song of the day. And you just listen to that a couple of times and you'll know how everybody felt. So there was, and both before and after VE Day for the entire war, this country was one person dedicated to winning this war, and solidarity that has never been matched since.
Okay. Well, let me ask any questions of our panelists and other contributors.
I've got a question for Sam Berman. Sam, I think you're too modest. Sam just very modestly said, well, I flew 70 combat missions. But I know from talking to you a few years ago that there was one particular mission that you might want to just elaborate on. You were airborne. You faced very heavy anti-aircraft fire. Remember that?
Yes, that was the 30th mission that I flew.
Would you mind just telling people about it? Because he's a hero and he's too modest to tell you about it. But this is an amazing story and I just thought you might want to hear it. Go ahead.
I'll just say that in those days, everybody was either a hero or,
yeah.
But
yeah,
this was my 30th mission. And I was flying as a bombardier at that time, bombardier navigator. And we were flying over a town in the Po Valley called Estiglia. And there was a railroad distribution center that the Germans were using to move their supplies. So our mission was to destroy that. So when we got, and that was very, very heavily defended. So when we got there, all of a sudden the anti-aircraft started blowing our groups apart. And we dropped our bombs, but we were all separated by that time. We flew in formations of 9 planes, and I think it might have been 4 or 5 formations of 9 planes. Anyway, all of a sudden we were alone. And when you saw anti-aircraft out your window, if it was a black puff, that was what you usually saw. If it had a red center, it was dangerous. And in this case, one exploded near us, and that was not just a red center, it was like a sheet of red. And it took out a lot of our plane. It took out one of the engines. I think out of the 6 of us, 3 people got Purple Hearts. I was disappointed that I didn't get one. but our plane started diving, and I was up in the nose flying as a bombardier. It was sort of a plexiglass encased thing, so I had a view of everything. And our plane was just diving straight toward the earth. And so I figured I'd better get out of here. So we were all wearing parachutes, so I went to the hatch to jump out of the plane, which didn't bother me a lot because in most cases, the Italian partisans controlled the countryside. If you had to be really unlucky to be picked up by the Germans, but I felt fairly safe that I would land in an area where the partisans would find me. In any case, at the last minute, I had my hand on the hatch and nobody else was going out. And they were all, it was crazy. Why weren't they leaving? So I turned around, the pilot compartment was behind me. So I went to the pilot compartment and I found both pilots that had slumped over in a daze. something had hit their plexiglass windshield, and they had a million cuts on their faces from the shards of glass, but nothing really that hampered them. It was just a bad sight. So I shook the co-pilot, and he looked at me, and we couldn't talk. The engines were too loud. I pointed toward the ground, and he tested his controls, and the plane righted. And he looked over and smiled. Then he tapped the pilot, and they then asked me to look at my charts to give them a heading to get back. So, and I wasn't very good at that. I'd just been trained for contact navigation. I knew we were over Parma, Italy. I could tell from the charts. So I picked a route out to the coast. And when we got near the coast, they said, "Is it safe to cross over here?" Because they knew that there was anti-aircraft along the coast, which I hadn't bothered to notice. So I looked and I said, "Uh-oh, no, don't go out here." And they said, so I said, "We'll just head north." So they did, and just as we did, we saw a few puffs, black puffs. They were shooting at us. So anyway, at some point, he said, "Is it all right to go out here?" And I said, "I suppose it is." So we left out, we got out of Italy, and they took over. Then they were able to find their heading back. We were flying out only one engine all this time. And our plane had hundreds of holes in it. And when we got back to Corsica, we landed at the first airport, which was not ours, was down the coast. We had to land as quick as we could. And the most seriously injured person on the plane was the one who was flying as operator. He had taken a piece of flak in his arm that jammed into his elbow, and he was in terrible pain. The guys were giving him as much morphine as they could to try and control the pain. I never saw him again. That's the story. I think it was over Astigli in Italy, and it was probably the most dangerous flight of the 70 that I flew on.
Thank you for mentioning that. That's a good story. I did not know that. Thank you. Any other questions?
I can't forget it.
I can understand that. I can understand that. So if there are no any questions, I'd like to thank everybody, and the panelists especially, and the contributors. It was a very interesting evening, and I hope we'll be able to broadcast it on YouTube, and many other people will be able to hear your stories. So thank you very much. And Dan, Sam, and Wilda, thank you very much. And Ivor and George. So good night.